So this is topic 5.7, and this is the balance of payments for Australia. And we've got annual data here in the first 3 columns, then quarterly data in the final 6 columns. We're just going to worry about the annual data. Now, there's a lot of different numbers here. And what I want to do in this video is just go through what you need to focus on with the balance of payments. So you certainly don't need to focus on every individual number and all of the debits and credits. We're looking at the balance of payments from a much higher, broader macro perspective. Not macro in the sense of macroeconomics, but macro in the sense of broad. So, okay, so what do you need to take away from the balance of payments? What do you need to know? Well, we're going to connect this balance of payments with this model. Okay, and in this model, we've got 2 curves or 2 economic variables. The first is S minus I, and the second is NX. So 2 variables in the model, and we move the lines back and forward, just like we do a demand and supply diagram. And we look at what happens to the exchange rate and how net exports change. We get insights into how the economy works. But fundamentally, we've got 2 economic variables here, which are exogenous to the model. So we've got S minus I and NX. The endogenous variable is the exchange rate. So 2 variables, S minus I and NX. S minus I equals this value here. So in the economy, when it moved from 2007 to 2008 to 2008, 2009, the value of the capital financial account dropped from 72 billion to about 39 billion. So the value of S minus I fell. In this model, that's the same as taking this line and shifting it to the left. The value fell. So it went from 72 billion down here to 39 billion down here. So a leftward shift in the S minus I line. And then from this year to this year, from 0809 to 0910, the value of S minus I, which is the same as the capital financial account, that balance went from 40 billion to 54 billion. Well, that's the same as if we want to model the impact that this had in the economy, the change in this value, change in the value of this variable, we would take this line and shift it to the right. The S minus I line, shift it to the right. So from here to here, the S minus I line shifts to the left. From that year to that year, the S minus I line shifts back to the right. So you need to understand that this value here, the value of the capital financial account balance, is represented by the value S minus I, so savings minus investment. And then the other thing you need to appreciate is the value of NX, which is this equation here, not this equation, this line. The value of NX is given by this value here. And that's the current account balance. Now, obviously, if we have a look at the 2 balances here, we've got 73 billion, 74, basically the same. 40 billion, 39 billion, 54 billion, 54 billion. On a quarterly basis, we've got 15.7, 15.6. So in terms of the data for Australia, S minus I does appear to be equal to NX. Why is that the case? Because the exchange rate moves to the intersection of these 2 lines for a reason I'll give you in the next video, and makes the value of NX and the value of SI the same value. So the exchange rate's moving up and down, just like a price. Just like in microeconomics, a price moves up and down to set demand equal to supply, so that demand and supply are the same numerical value, the same in this diagram here. The exchange rate's moving up and down to that equilibrium point, and there, NX and S minus I have the same numerical value, those 2 variables. It's exactly what we're seeing in the balance of payments. Okay, that's the first thing that you need to appreciate. The second thing you need to appreciate is that the current account balance plus the capital financial account balance sum to 0. We've already been. So this number here, minus 74.253 and positive 72.572, I see those as effectively the same number, and they're close enough, they sum to 0. We've got down here a small net errors and omissions. That is all about the Australian Bureau of Statistics not being able to measure all of the economic transactions that are included in these overall totals perfectly. Okay, just imagine trying to accurately measure all economic transactions involving an Australian and a foreigner. It's very, very difficult. And of course, you're going to have net errors and omissions where these two numbers don't exactly equal. So that's the second thing that you need to appreciate. The third thing you need to appreciate is when we talk about the capital financial account, just think foreign investment. So the capital financial account's very small, trivial balance. So we can almost ignore what's in the capital financial account, and if you ask me what's in the capital account, what sort of transactions are in the capital account, my answer would probably be, I don't care. It's just tiny little trivial amounts and very strange, weird, obscure transactions. No one cares about the capital account anymore. The financial account is where all of the action is. And have a look at this. Direct investment, portfolio investment, financial derivatives, which is a type of investment, other investment. And because the balance of payments only includes transactions involving an Australian and a foreigner, all of these different investments must be foreign investment. Now remember, this is not the investment included in the aggregate demand curve. When we go C plus I plus G plus NX, that I is investment spending. This is foreign investment. It's a different type of investment. As I've said before, this type of foreign investment may lead to an increase in the type of investment included in the aggregate demand curve. It may not. So in terms of the capital financial account, just think to yourself foreign investment. Now, in terms of the current account, it is true in Australia's case that the bulk of our current account deficit, it's deficit because it's a negative number, is due to a deficit on the primary income account. That is true. The secondary income, once again, trivial numbers. But when you think of the current account, I really just want you to think net exports. Just acknowledge that there is a big primary income deficit here, but just think net exports. The reason for that will become more clear in the second video. Okay, so as I said, acknowledge that we do have a primary income deficit, but acknowledge that the goods and services deficit, well, there was a surplus in that year, the goods and services balance is, just think of that as the main part of the current account. Now, part of the reason we're doing that is that the balance on primary income doesn't change much. It went from 49 billion deficit to 45 to 48. Compare that to the balance on goods and services, which is the net trade. The net trade or net exports. It went from 24 billion to positive 7 to minus 3. So there's big fluctuations in the goods and services balance. That is net trade, it's NX. The primary income balance doesn't change very much at all. Now, primary income, you've probably picked it up from your reading, that is mainly interest payments and dividend payments. And because these numbers are negative, it means in net terms, we are paying more dividend payments and interest payments to foreigners than they're paying to us. In fact, in this first column, right next to primary income debits, you can see a negative figure of minus $93.713 billion. That is an estimate in that year of how much interest and dividend payments we paid to foreigners. $93 billion we paid them. They paid us 44.217 because, of course, we own some foreign bonds and we own some foreign shares. And the 44.217 billion is the return on those shares. But we're only interested in the net position, and the net position is minus $49.496 billion. And that was a net outflow of money. So the next thing that is important to understand is, well, the last one was just consider the current account to be primarily about net exports. That's the most interesting part. But the next thing to note is that a negative number means more money is flowing out of Australia than is flowing in. So We've already motivated the primary income deficit. That means we're paying more interest payments and dividend payments to foreigners than they're paying us. What about the capital financial account? Positive number. What that means is that any positive number means there's more money flowing into Australia than flowing out of Australia associated with the transactions that are listed in the capital financial account. So when I see a positive number here of 72.572 billion, a positive number, I think to myself, more money was flowing into Australia as a result of foreign investment flows than was flowing out. Now, when that happens, that means we're bringing in more foreign investment money than we are investing overseas. So in a sense, in net terms, we are drawing upon foreigners, we're drawing upon their savings. We're borrowing from them in net terms. Yes, we're lending to them, but we're borrowing more from them. And so that is why we have a positive number, which is a net inflow of money. Now, the tricky part here is that because we have a net inflow of money, it must mean that S minus I is negative, indicating that we don't have enough domestic savings to fund all of our domestic borrowing. That's why we have a net inflow of foreign investment money to cover the gap. In fact, the difference between S and I in Australia in this year would have been approximately $72.527 billion. So the difference between S and I, we don't know the values of S and I, but we do know the value of the difference between those two variables. It's right there, 72.572 billion. And so because S minus I must have been negative to actually facilitate this net inflow of foreign investment money, when we come to draw S minus I in this diagram, it's actually going to have a negative number. Now, I've just labeled a positive there. We'll get to that in the next video, but just keep that in mind. So if we were drawing this diagram using these numbers, then we would have equilibrium at minus 74 billion. So the value of NX would be minus 74 billion. That's what it says down here, or up here at the top. But then we've got minus 74 billion here as well. I know it's not minus 74 billion, but it's close enough. So we've got positive 74 billion down here. But because positive, you can only have a net inflow of foreign investment money into the country of positive $74 billion. If S minus I is negative, then when we draw the S minus I line for this particular year, 2007-2008, then we would have minus 74 billion down here. It's about the only trick in linking these data to that model. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need to know. Don't worry about the capital account. Financial account, it's all about foreign investment flows. Positive numbers means more money is flowing into Australia than flowing out. So in terms of the current account, the deficit here on the goods and services balance for 2007-2008, that's negative. That means more money was flowing out of Australia than flowing in. That's what a negative number means. That can only happen if in that year, imports were greater than exports. The next year, 2008-2009, the goods and services balance changes to 7.622 billion. It's a positive number. That means a net inflow of money associated with goods and services trade. That can only happen if exports are greater than imports. So hopefully you're getting the idea. Don't worry about secondary income, small, insignificant. Acknowledge that primary income, that Australia has a big primary income deficit, but when you think current account, yes, think about the primary income deficit that we have, but focus in your mind a little bit more on goods and services trade, and that's how you can then equate net exports and kind of call NX the current account balance if we we sort of, it's a little bit tricky to sort of get to that point. I'll explain it more in the next video. But yeah, just for now, the current account balance, ignore secondary income. Primary income, acknowledge that it exists, but it doesn't vary much over time. And so when you think about the current account, think mainly what's of major interest is the goods and services balance, because that's the one that fluctuates over time, and that is the one that therefore needs to be explained. Because the primary income deficit doesn't fluctuate much over time, it's easy to explain that. It would take me 20 seconds to explain to you why this primary income balance fluctuates over time. It's basically because of changes in interest rates and changes in dividend payout ratios. What would be harder for me to do is explain to you why the goods and services balance changes over time. And ultimately, that's what we want to do. So if you've got a variable that's not changing much over time, it's going to be really easy to explain why that's the case, and it's of little interest to us. Whereas the goods and services balance, that does fluctuate a lot. Just look at the quarterly data. You get big swings, but the primary income balance on a quarterly basis doesn't change that much at all. So that's why I want you to think of the current account. Well, that's why I want you to think of net exports, which is the same as the goods and services balance. That goods and services balance is net exports. That's why I want you to think of that as the most important part of the current account, even though it's not the major part of the current account balance. It's the more important, more interesting part, even though the current account is made up mainly of the primary income deficit.